Hey everybody, Lex here with another Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree build video. This time we're looking at a build that I've been having a lot of fun with, the Storm Knights. The DLC introduced a few pieces of gear that boost storm abilities, so in this video we're going to look at just what those storm abilities are, their viability in invasions and duels and PvE scenarios, though more leaning on the PvP side of things this time because I think there are very few storm abilities that are like actually good in PvE, but the few that are good in PvE are very good. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's get to it. So when we talk about storm abilities or storm skills, just what are we talking about here? The vast majority are honestly just Ashes of War. They are Stormcaller, Horn-Calling Storm, Storm Assault, Zamor Ice Storm, the Ash of War, and last but absolutely not least, Stormblade. There are two others here, Storm Stomp and Storm Shield, but these are more used for their utility. We want to focus on skills that actually deal storm damage. Storm Shield is a bit of a meme, and I forgot it existed in the game, to be honest, but Storm Stomp is a useful Ash of War, especially in PvP. You can combo people into light attacks, but the Ash itself doesn't do a lot of damage. It's more used for its stagger potential into those light attacks, so that's why it's not included on this list. Divine Beast Tornado and Zamor Ice Storm, the sorcery, are also boosted by these storm boosting items like the Divine Beast Helm and the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman, but I ran most of this stuff on a certain type of strength build, so we're going to be focusing mostly on the Ashes of War here. But for fun, I did make a Strength Faith hybrid build to get a little more mileage out of the Divine Beast Tornado, and, well, you'll see the results. Anyways, back to the Ashes. We're going to start with the one that I think is strongest, Stormblade. It's kind of funny how easy it is to sleep on this one since it's accessible so early in the game. You can just buy this from Bernal at the War Master's Shack in Limgrave, but holy hell, I cannot believe how good this is. To briefly describe its utility, it's a spammable mid-range projectile that often hits harder than your weapon's melee swings, depending on your stats. I say spammable because the animation time is fairly quick, can be used rapidly, and the FP cost is actually reduced after the first swing, so spamming is seemingly encouraged. Also, super important, but up close the projectile and the melee swing can hit at once for big damage. I think this may have been nerfed at some point, but it's still super strong. I don't think you want to put this Ash on a weapon that swings faster than, you know, the maximum swinging speed of the Ash of War as you're spamming it, as you get a way bigger DPS benefit when you make a slower, heavier hitting weapon swing faster with the Ash of War spam. So I chose to throw this in Freya's Greatsword, infused as heavy, and I'm using it on a strength build. I initially toyed around with these Ashes on a few different builds since Storm Damage scales best with quality, and if you're unfamiliar with the quality affinity, it basically means that the weapon will scale best with strength and dexterity evenly split, and I also tried it out on a pure 80 dex build just to see what the numbers look like, but the gains were minimal, and ultimately those builds just felt super inefficient when trying to build like this. Like if you're going to try and hit that 80 soft cap for a damage scaling stat, strength just seems so good because you only have to hit 54 strength, and then two-hand your weapon to hit it, since you get 50% more strength when two-handing. No other damage stat works like that, and you just give up so much utility when forking points over into dex for a build like this. I'd rather have more mind for FP, especially for this Ash, more stamina, more faith for buffs like Flame Grant Me Strength. You get the idea. Anyways, we'll look more closely at the stats later. In PvE, Stormblade is an absolute monster, often hitting hard enough to one or two shot most mobs at mid-range. And when I say mid-range, I mean like the longer part of mid-range. And it has a strong hit stun attached to it. You can often just straight up stun lock some enemies, and at times bosses. I honestly cannot say enough good about this Ash in PvE. It feels like you can worry less about positioning and take advantage of every punish opportunity that presents itself as long as you're mid-range, by either hitting with the melee plus projectile or the projectile itself. The range also lets you hit a boss's weak spot pretty consistently, like the heads of dragons, which can be difficult at times as a pure melee build. As a quick side note, this has been making my New Game Plus playthrough an absolute breeze. You can just honestly go into some boss fights in some rooms and just spam the Ash of War without changing position and just wipe the floor with whatever it is you're fighting. Super easy, super fast. I honestly highly recommend it. Alright, so how does it fare in PvP? Well, it's also amazing. Spammable projectile that does big damage and also huge damage up close if both the projectile and melee swing connect. You'll be winning most trades, believe me. I also really like the ranged utility in invasions, as a lot of players for some reason aren't expecting you to throw one at them as they try to drink, you know, what they think is out of range. I was honestly super surprised at how consistently I was able to finish off phantoms that thought they could just heal by throwing out a well-timed storm blast their way. Yeah, if there's anything you take away from this video, it's to try out Stormblade with this build. It's very strong. The only downside is that you have to pay attention to the way you're facing when you're trying to use this skill, because sometimes if you're trying to make the melee swing and projectile connect, if you're not facing square onto your target, the projectile will miss and you will hit them with the melee attack only. Alright, after praising the hell out of Stormblade, that's not to say that the other Storm Ashes aren't useful or perform better in some scenarios. Let's talk about the Horned Warrior's Greatsword and its Ash of War, Horn-Calling Storm. This thing recently got buffed to do more PvE damage, but I think it's pretty useful in PvP as well. Also, real quick, the damage of this Ash of War simply scales with the scaling of the weapon, not pure faith. I don't know why there are commenters saying it scales with faith with absolutely no basis to do so. Just why? You know you didn't test this. Why are you misinforming people with zero confirmed information? Just to look like you know something? God, the internet is so goddamn stupid sometimes. Anyways, weapon scaling on this thing is mediocre. It's a somber weapon, so you can't infuse it, and it scales best with strength at a B rating. So as far as attack rating goes, it's alright. It's not terrible, but you could easily do better. Really, you use this thing for its Ash of War, which is very good in groups of enemies, whether it's PvE or invasions. It also does a lot of damage against single targets in PvE, although at a pretty high FP cost, and I feel like you want to spend that extra FP for the AoE effect, so I'd probably use it against multiple enemies when able. It is quite strong in PvP though. You're able to catch panic rollers with the first two parts of this Ash of War if you catch them close enough with the first two hits and they're in melee range. It's also super useful for preventing other players from approaching you from behind while you're smacking someone down as well. Feels kind of like Stormcaller, but with a little less damage and a lot of extra range. Overall, pretty solid Ash. I like this one for invasions mostly, as most duelists know how to avoid this Ash or know to, back the hell off if you hit them with the first part, and you get more value out of it in invasion since it seems built to hit multiple targets anyway. I like it. Speaking of Stormcaller, you're up next. PvPers, you're likely well acquainted with this one already, but Stormcaller is like the previous Ash of War, just with shortened range and higher damage. I'm going to focus mostly on the PvP aspect here because while this is usable in PvE, I find the animation time to be pretty long and therefore cumbersome to perform, especially in the more fast-paced DLC fights. So I generally didn't use this Ash much for PvE, and honestly the rest of the Ashes on this list are going to be similar, niche but strong PvP uses, not so great PvE uses. Alright, now that that's out of the way, I ended up throwing this on a frost-infused Great Katana because the multi-hit effect that comes along with this Ash of War is great for status buildup. The weapon's reach is also just long enough to make this Ash more effective, though you could also slap it on a longer halberd type weapon like the Knight Rider's Glaive or something. I just like the idea of building up both blood loss and frostbite in one weapon since the Great Katana has innate bleed. The Ash has 3 parts, the first windup that comes out pretty fast and hits 3 times, then 2 follow-ups that hit twice each. You move forward a little bit with each follow-up, but in PvP if someone has rolled out of range you likely won't catch them as it's a pretty short distance. But yeah, this is a pretty strong tool to use both defensively and offensively. This can get people off of you if players are being aggressive, but also if you tag someone with a light attack, sometimes you can combo them into the Ash depending on your positioning, which will do a ton of damage. And with any luck, you will proc both bleed and frost, but at the very least, frostbite will definitely go off. You might need a follow-up hit or 2 for bleed. It also has decent hyper armor, so you'll likely pull this off even if getting smacked. But yeah, pretty strong Ash of War in PvP, kinda F for PvE, and don't perform the follow-ups on this Ash if your target is seemingly getting out of range. Speaking of get off me tools, Zamor Ice Storm is probably the best one for the job, to be honest. And I'm of course talking about the Ash of War that comes along with the Zamor Curve Sword weapon, and boy does it do damage. Against brain-rotted players, you can often just kill them within the duration of the storm because the storm does decent damage and procs frostbite pretty quickly. Yeah, it's damn good. However, with this build in particular, you don't really want to be swinging this weapon for its attack rating since it's a dex scaling somber weapon, so you're basically using this thing for the Ash of War only. But trust me, the Ash of War is so good, it makes it worth hard swapping to in invasions. As far as PvE goes, as mentioned earlier, not so great, but if you find a punish window in a boss fight where you can perform the animation and you absolutely must apply frost, the Ash of War will do it 9 times out of 10. I say 9 times out of 10, but honestly I didn't come across a single boss that didn't get frostbitten with one use of the skill. The status buildup is super fast, so there's that at least. Just be prepared to take a hit on some of the faster bosses because the animation time is up there. Alright, last we got Storm Assault. It's got good hyper armor on its startup animation and really big single target damage during the second part of the Ash, which you can true combo players into if you hit them with the first part. There are also some lasting frames with the Storm Winds on the second part of the Ash too, so if someone tries to attack you right after you perform this Ash, they might get knocked back and take a small chunk of damage. I think I was thinking around 300-ish. Compared to the other Ashes, I think weapon damage is most important here, as I found that even when testing quality builds to, maximally boost the storm damage, this one would always hit harder if I just made sure my weapon's attack rating was as high as I could get it. So for this build I ended up slapping it on the heavy sword lance since it has very good strength scaling even if it's only A and not S, but obviously you should slap this on any weapon where you can get a high attack rating so that it hits that much harder. Anyways, I think it's strong for 1v1 situations like duels, especially if you don't let your opponent know you have this up your sleeve and catch them with the combo after you've tagged them a few times. You can just outright finish off some opponents like that. In invasions it's a similar story, very strong against single targets, but to be honest I felt like it lacked the crowd control or the ability to create space that the other Storm Ashes provided, though again, it is effective for picking off people one by one if they happen to be spread out. For PvE, it's a similar story, pretty big single target damage, but in the DLC, the animation time felt a bit too long, and you get punished since you are locked into this animation against some pretty nimble bosses. I think that's one of my biggest turnoff with certain skills in Elden Ring as a whole, that feeling of being locked into an animation with how quick things can occur in PvP and PvE. Like, you really need to be able to react at a moment's notice, and if an animation takes too long to perform, more often than not, you're going to get punished in some capacity. But I digress. Again, strong in duel since the animation time matters less if you're just destroying someone who, you know, can't act while they're getting comboed. Overall, I think the big all-around winner here out of these Ashes of War is Stormblade for sure, but I find myself still using Horn-Calling Storm, Stormcaller, and Zamor Ice Storm when the situations present themselves in invasions. If you're going to run this build, those are the 4 Ashes I'd use, though again, Storm Assault has some strong potential too, especially in duels. Now, about Divine Beast Tornado that recently received that buff. As I said earlier, I tried this out on a hybrid Strength Faith build using the Claw Mark seal and getting around 280 incantation scaling, and what I'll say is that it was fun to use. The way this incantation works is that it is a chargeable tornado that you eventually toss towards your target or wherever you free aim, and the tornado travels a bit, stops, and stays there a bit, then disappears. If you are able to space the spell properly and have the end of the tornado where it just sits there for a second hit your target, you'll often tag them twice, and it is pretty damn good damage, to be honest. Unfortunately, even after the buff, it's still a little jank. It has some trouble with upwards and downward slopes, and sometimes the tornado will just straight up disappear if it collides with terrain, robbing you of that precious double damage you should be shooting for. Despite these problems, though, I still think it has potential, and I'm going to toy around with it more. Might be good as a roll catcher if you get good at free aiming it, and this current footage is without the Godfrey icon, so maybe this could be more worth it if it were a faith-focused build coupled in with that talisman and boosting the damage further, so I think it might demand some further experimentation. Alright, so here are the stats I ran with. It's similar to my Greatsword of Solitude build in some ways, but since we're wearing the Divine Beast Helm for that extra storm damage, we get a nice bonus of +3 strength and +3 dex attached to this thing, so we only need to hit 51 strength. I leveled dex to 15, which is now 18 due to the helmet, and that's the minimum to use the Zamor curved sword. 60 vigor, obviously the minimum for any real build, just saying, level your vigor. And we have a bunch of points in mind and endurance. This is to strengthen Stormblade's spam potential, but obviously it's just useful to have these stats in general, and of course the ability to wear the heavy Solitude armor, which is just so strong, especially poise-wise, so this will help with survivability and trading attacks. This amount of endurance also allows me to equip a decent offhand weapon. I was running the bone bow, as you can see here, but you can throw something else on there, a parry tool or something with quick step perhaps. 15 faith here for the incantation utility, flame grant me strength, bestial vitality, etc. Oh, let's also go over some talisman and physics and some of the gear real quick. This is the usual talisman set I go with in PvP, Erdtree's Favor +2, Enraged Divine Beast, and Shard of Alexander. Basically never move. And Bulgos is the flex spot. I switch this out with the two-handed talisman for PvE, but sometimes I'll hard swap to the Crimson Seed talisman +1 for a heal if I'm able, since the Divine Beast Helm reduces our healing a good bit. Yeah, if you didn't know, this helmet reduces the Flask of Crimson Tears healing by around 9% from what I understand, but it boosts storm damage by a little over 5%. I know in some places online they say it's 4%, but they're wrong. I tested this. It's a little over 5%. And of course we're boosting our storms by another 10% with the Enraged Divine Beast talisman for a total of around 15% more storm damage, which ain't bad for skills that deal a lot of pure storm damage. Pretty damn good for this build. Alright, so physics are pretty basic. For PvP, I run the Crimson Bubble tier for a free heal if I get bursted down, but I also run the Leaden Hard tier for the extra poise. I really don't want to get staggered when I'm winding up one of those juicy area of effect Ash of Wars. Thorny Cracked tier is also not a bad option since we have some rapidly hitting Ashes of War, and even Stormblade swings fast enough to activate it if you're hitting melee swings while spamming it, so definitely worth a consideration for sure in PvE. The Strength Faith hybrid build pulls points from Endurance and a bit from Mind to crank up Faith to 40, which is decent especially when used with the Claw Mark seal. I simply switched my chest piece to Letta's armor to boost sprinting attacks, as a lot of these weapons have good ones, especially the curved greatswords for roll catching. But yeah, this build is mostly for us to utilize Divine Beast Tornado as a fun harassment tool. Again, I don't think it's super strong, but it is very fun to use. And I feel like another content creator out there might be able to optimize the thing to be able to kill people in that double tap part of the spell cast. Yeah, try it out if you want. You'll definitely embody the theme of the storm more with this build. So that's the video, guys. I've honestly been having so much fun with this storm build. I just love slapping Stormblade on a heavy hitting weapon. The damage is really insane, even without status effects that you could probably throw on Frostbite on the weapon that you're throwing Stormblade on. It would probably go off pretty reasonably, but then you give up the ability to use greases and you get split damage, so maybe. Definitely try those other Ashes and those weapon combos out in invasions and duels and let me know what you think of their effectiveness. But for now, that's going to be it, guys. Till next time.